Well, this is another one of John's treasures, but it's more of a secret than a treasure. And what I want to do today is to explain some of the things that create a successful racing car. So one of the first things we need to look at is the suspension and the springs. Now the springs on an Austin 7 are leaf springs, and they are separated, the leaves are separated with zinc interleaves, and the zinc interleaves look like this. And these are cut and shaped already to the right width to fit the springs, and then you cut them off to fit the springs, one for each layer of spring, and you round the ends off so they fit the springs as well. And then you have to make sure that the springs are closely packed together and held by these little clamps on the spring leaf. And the whole idea is that with the zinc interleaves, it stops the hysteresis effect in the springing, so that the springs can move smoothly without jumping. And then the springs are bound together to stop them flapping like this when you go over a bump, so that they don't get front wheel tramp. And you do the same on the back springs as well. So that's one of the things you have to do with an Austin 7 to get it to handle properly. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on today is the question of the clutch. Now, on an Austin 7, you have a center clutch plate which looks like that, which is driven from the engine, and it fits in the gearbox, and as that goes round, it has a pressure plate on one side and a flywheel on the other. And normally on an Austin 7, the material for the pressure plates is made of Ferodo, which is like a fabric covered sort of stuff. But what they do with these racing cars is, because they give much more power than the standard engine, once this starts to slip, it builds up heat and it melts the surface of the plate so that it ends up with a little ridge of metal at the end of each of these slots. And from then on, they always slip. So what we do with an Austin 7 is we make the linings in cast iron. Now I know that sounds a bit frantic, but in fact they make a very smooth clutch. And so what you do is you rivet cast iron linings onto the pressure plate and the flywheel, so that when this slips, it takes the heat away into the flywheel and into the pressure plate, so that it doesn't melt the surface of the clutch. And that's a very important factor when racing an Austin 7. Right, now we'll just have a look at the engine for a moment. And there's various differences on this engine. It's not a standard engine. It has a train of gears up across the front, and has a water pump fitted as a standard fitting, and then it has a drive down here which drives the supercharger, and the fan pulley, which is here, is actually quite a lot wider than the standard arrangement and has a special belt. So that's another special thing about this engine. As you can see, this is the inlet manifold which is attached to the supercharger, which is down there, and this is a blow-off valve which blows off when it gets over a certain poundage. So that's really how it all works. Now down here there's a little valve, so when you open the throttle it opens a valve which allows oil to go into the supercharger via the carburettor, and there's a special tank for that up here, and there's a spare tank for fuel for the engine, and that's the main fuel tank, and that's all pressurized. You have a pump here which pumps the tank up, and a gauge to tell you what the pressure is. So when it gets to 2 pounds or so, you're ready to go. So you pump it up, and you have to have a riding mechanic along here who sits in this little space here, and he pumps it when you give him a nudge. So when it gets down to below 2 pounds, you tell him a nudge. And then you've got all these instruments here as well. You've got the boost pressure in this gauge here, the oil pressure here, which runs at about 60 pounds, choke, which you pull out to start the engine. You've got the magneto on and off switch here, and you've got a speedometer here with a trip, a rev counter to 6,000, and the tank pressure gauge there. And these levers here are for the ignition and the accelerator, so you can hand throttle it as well. And it has a hand horn as well. Right, so that's sort of it in a way. Now the other side of the engine is interesting as well, because it has, these are called footman loops, by the way, and the hinge down the middle is made of German silver, as is the original early badge that fits on the front of the car. And these, and this is where the sparks are generated. It has a racing magneto, which is made by ML, which is different from the standard magneto, which is a BLIC, which stands for British Lighting and Ignition Company. But the BLIC, or BLIC, magneto does not have a safety gap. So you must never spin a BLIC magneto by hand to see if it works or not, because if you do, it builds up electricity in the coils and there's nowhere for them to go. There's no safety gap in it, whereas these mags have a safety gap. And then you can see the water pump down here, which is also gear driven off the front of the crankcase. And so it's quite a different engine from the standard engine, and very complicated in some ways. This one's fitted with a pressure crankshaft as well, and there's a special bottle on the front of the crankshaft which is fed to the oil pipe down here, which is off the main oil gallery, and it feeds oil into this like an oil bottle on the front of the crankshaft, which we mount these days. I make a new bottle, and it's got rubber O-rings around, so that because the crankshaft flexes, it tends to move, so you have to have some compliance in it so that it doesn't bind up. So that gives you some idea of the complexity of this engine. Thank you very much.